Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for Leo and Leo rising for the entire year of 2020. So, tonight I'm going to be doing a live stream where I'm going to go through over the course of the next 40 minutes to an hour, the next 12 months of the year, and give you sort of a broad overview of some of the major planetary transits and some of the parts of your birth chart that are going to be activated over the course of the next year. So, this horoscope is for Leo and Leo rising. And while you can look at it from the perspective of your sun sign, if your sun is in the zodiacal sign of Leo, especially if you're born during the day, or your moon sign, especially if your moon was in Leo when you're born and you were born at night, I'd really recommend looking at these horoscopes primarily from the perspective of your rising sign. So, if you don't know that, you can get a copy of your birth chart if you go to websites like astro.com. Enter in your birth information, including the exact birth time, and then it'll tell you what your ascendant or your rising sign is. So if you have Leo rising, then this video is primarily for you. All right, let's jump into it. Let's pull up the calendar for January. So we're going to be looking at a few different pieces of artwork here from some calendars and some posters that I released this year, which show the astrology of the next 12 months. One of them is the planetary alignments calendar, which shows when different planets move into different signs, when the new moon and full moons will take place each month, eclipses, as well as planetary, some planetary aspects and most planetary stations, like when a planet stations retrograde or direct. I've also got the planetary movements poster for this year, which shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of 2020. All right, so let's start off with January. So the big thing in January is this is happening during eclipse season, and we have an eclipse that's taking place, a lunar eclipse that's taking place on the 10th of January, and that's taking place in Cancer, which is your 12th house. Just before that, in December, we had a solar eclipse, which took place in Capricorn in your 6th house of health and work. These eclipses are kind of wrapping up a series of eclipses this year that have been going on for at least a year now, and it's sort of compounded with some other major transits going through the sign of Capricorn, especially, and to a lesser extent, the sign of Cancer later in the year. So we'll get into that more in just a little bit because I want to talk about Saturn going through Capricorn as well as Jupiter. But I also want to mention the other major outer planet transits happening this month are Uranus stationing direct in Taurus at 2 degrees, which is in your 10th whole sign house, which is the place in the chart that has to do with your career. So this is a long-term transit that's taking place over the course of most of the next decade. It only really got fully started about a year ago when Uranus permanently moved into the sign of Taurus and into your 10th house of career. Sometimes the transit of Uranus through the 10th house can indicate sort of like shakeups or unexpected disruptions that take place in the context of your career or your overall life direction. So previously, that can kind of be positive sometimes, or it can be more challenging other times. If you previously had a specific career or set sort of direction in life, there could be something that comes along that shakes things up a little bit and sends you in a course that's different or a trajectory that's different than where you might have been headed up to this point. So we're still relatively early in this transit, so it may not be super important for you yet unless you have planets very early in the fixed signs, such as Taurus, Leo, Aquarius, or Scorpio. But it's definitely something to start paying attention to because once the transit is finished, things related to your career may look much different than when you went into it. And sometimes there can be a sort of curveball that comes out of nowhere that you didn't anticipate that shakes things up. So this year we're going to get about a third of the way through that transit because Uranus is going to make it to about 10 degrees of Taurus later in the year before going retrograde again. But this month in January represents one of the important turning points of that entire transit because Uranus is stationing in that sign at the very beginning of the year. So that's one of the major outer planet transits I wanted to mention. Aside from that, in January, let's see, besides the eclipses, we also have a Saturn-Pluto conjunction that's taking place in Capricorn in your 6th house. So at this point, we're about 2 years through this transit of Saturn through your sixth house. And traditionally, the sixth house signifies or relates to things like illness, injuries, work, and if you own your own business, it can relate to employees or people that are in a subordinate position to you in general. So for the most part, oftentimes with a transit like this, with Saturn going through the sixth house, it can raise issues related to health or how you take care of yourself in terms of your daily routine and in terms of how well you take care of your body and do sort of normal maintenance issues that need to happen or need to take place. And sometimes a transit of Saturn through the sixth house can raise or bring issues to the surface that way that they can be dealt with and addressed. And then in the future, you can hopefully not have to come back to that, or at least maintain a better overall state of health than when you would end the transit. So you're about 2/3 of the way through this transit at this point, with Saturn finishing up the last year of transiting through Capricorn. So for most of you, whatever themes are going to be brought up by this transit have already started to happen or become very clear. And unless you have planets in very late cardinal signs, I wouldn't necessarily expect it to culminate at this point. But instead, for the majority of you, that the peak period or the most critical point in this transit may have already come and gone, and you're just in the process of wrapping up the last phases of it at this point over the course of the next year. So certainly, because there is a Saturn-Pluto conjunction around 22 Capricorn this month in January, if you do have any planets around 22 degrees of cardinal signs like Capricorn, Aries, Cancer, or Libra, it could be a particularly important turning point in terms of that. And if you have a night chart, it might tend to be a little bit more difficult or coincide with a difficult episode that you have to address, especially in terms of your work or in terms of health. Whereas if you have a day chart, it might be more of a surmountable difficulty or some sort of obstacle that comes up that you just have to deal with and address at that time. So that's certainly with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. If you have planets at 22 degrees hitting an important turning point, but otherwise this is going to be a long-term transit that's going to be playing out off and on between now and December, when Saturn leaves Capricorn for the final time and you completely finish that entire sixth house transit altogether, which will have lasted for 3 years at that point in time. All right, so we've got those two transits. I mentioned the eclipse in Cancer. So it's probably bringing to culmination a series of events that started 6 months earlier. And the 12th house is kind of, again, like the sixth house, a tricky house. Sometimes it has to do with things like enemies traditionally, or people in your life that work at cross purposes to you. And that can be sometimes people that you just don't get along with, and relationships in your life that are problematic for you. And at this point, you might see an additional spotlight focused on some of those relationships so that things are brought to your attention that you have to address, hopefully for the better, or hopefully in a constructive way, so that you can air some of that out and then move forward from that point. Other times, the 12th house can have to do with instances in which we become our own worst enemy, or in which we do things that can sort of undermine us or undermine what we want to accomplish in life. So this could have been something that started 6 months earlier, where sometimes if we instigate like a bad habit, it can sort of eventually grow and develop and turn into something that's more significant. So during this time period, especially in January, it might be important to think about if there's any ways in which you're doing things that might be undermining yourself in the long term, and how you might make even minor changes in order to change your trajectory and send yourself in a more positive direction, where you start lessening the impact of some of those sort of bad habits, but instead creating more constructive ones for the future. All right, so those are the main things in January. The last thing that I wanted to mention that kind of balances out some of these transits is that just about a month ago, we don't just have Saturn transiting through the sixth house, and we don't just have Pluto transiting there, but also Jupiter ingressed into Capricorn, and we'll be spending pretty much the entirety of 2020 going through that sign as well, which is going to balance out some of the more challenging or problematic health signatures that Saturn has already been bringing to that sector of your chart for the past 2 years, and instead going to create a little bit more of a sense of optimism and a little bit more of a sense of growth when it comes to not just health matters, but also potentially work matters as well. And to some extent, this might tie in a little bit with some of the transits going on with Uranus through your 10th house, where we have some sense of like innovation or even a revolution of what you thought your overall career and life direction was. And Jupiter trining that, moving through your 6th house of work, and perhaps creating some more opportunities in terms of your workspace, whatever it is that you do for work, where you might be able to open up new avenues to become more successful and more productive in terms of your day-to-day job. So that's definitely one of the more positive potentials of that transit, in addition to some of the potentially positive counterbalancing influence in terms of health, where since you've had Saturn going through the 6th house for 2 years now, that may have raised some issues. And now with Jupiter moving through the same sign over the course of the next year, that may open up some opportunities to find solutions to problems that Saturn raised over the past 2 years. So perhaps finally having some sort of breakthrough in terms of some sort of health issue that you've been struggling with, or something that was previously difficult to solve, becomes a little bit easier, or you're able to connect with somebody that has the information or the knowledge that you need in order to overcome or deal with that issue or obstacle. So that's one of the other positive transits or potentials of Jupiter. And we'll see different turning points with that during the course of the year, especially when Jupiter stations retrograde and direct, which is going to happen twice over the course of the next few months. All right, so that's some of the major stuff in January. Just checking in on the live stream. Thanks everybody for joining us. I appreciate it. If anybody, especially any Leo risings, have any questions or comments about how specific transits that I'm talking about have worked out for them so far, then please let me know in the chat. I realize it's kind of late, but thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, thank you. All right, so let me move on to February. All right, so moving into February, the major shift that happens that's notable, it happens weirdly about this on the same day, which is February 16th. And this is the day that Mars moves out of Sagittarius and moves into Capricorn. So it moves into your 6th house, where it joins Saturn and Jupiter and Pluto, which I was just talking about in the context of both work as well as health. And that can be a little bit problematic because Mars can bring either a great abundance of energy, where you have to put more energy and more work into basically your work during that time period. So it could be a particularly stressful period at work where you're having to work longer hours or work harder in terms of your day job for some reason over the course of the next few weeks while Mars is transiting through that sign. On the other end of the spectrum, it could be a period in which there could be greater tensions, or in which there could be conflict or potentially strife in the workplace, where sometimes the abundance of energy that Mars brings to a sector of the chart can overflow and turn into sometimes like an open conflict. So that's something to be a little bit careful about. It can also be a challenging time where more acute type health issues can come up that are short term but still notable. So it would be good to be extra cautious during that time as Mars is transiting through your 6th house, not to do anything impulsive that could put you in a difficult situation where you could have like an accident or an injury. That would be my best piece of advice in terms of Mars going through the 6th house. Or like if you go to the gym, don't overexert yourself so that you cause yourself to have an injury just due to, enthusiasm or wanting to get a good workout or what have you. But what's notable is that very same day that Mars moves into Capricorn and into your 6th house, Mercury also is stationing retrograde around that time, around February 16th. And this retrograde is actually happening in Pisces. And As we can see here, Pisces is your eighth house or your eighth whole sign house if you have Leo rising. The eighth house typically has two primary significations. One of them is mortality and issues surrounding mortality. The other topics in the eighth house that are pretty common is other people's money or the resources that belong to other people or your partner in particular, especially if you're in a long-term either romantic relationship or business partnership. So Mercury going retrograde, it's actually going to go retrograde pretty closely conjunct Neptune. So one of the things I'd be careful about is miscommunications involving financial matters, especially involving other people. So if you have any sort of financial involvement with either a partner or a romantic partner or business partner, and you have some sort of financial exchange, just be sure that everything is clear and is written out in in a clear of language as possible, since there might be a greater tendency towards miscommunications and sort of verbal snafus and misunderstandings during this time. If you're signing a contract that involves financial things, you might want to be extra careful, or you might want to move the time frame of signing that contract a little bit before or a little bit after this, especially after this Mercury retrograde, just because the conjunction with Neptune at the same time kind of amplifies some of the already sort of nebulous significations that Mercury retrogrades already bring anytime they go retrograde in a certain part of our chart. You have, of course, Neptune transiting through the eighth house, which itself brings nebulousness to the sector of other people's money or the partner's money, which is a pretty long-term, decade-long transit. But something like a Mercury retrograde there could set off a specific incident related to that, where you have to go back and review some sort of agreement or some sort of verbal communication that involved financial matters. The eighth house also pertains to taxes and debts. So it could be something related to that as well, where you have to go back and review something that you thought was finished, but may come back into your life for some reason. So that Mercury retrograde begins on the 16th of February. The halfway point is about the 25th of February, and then it's already finished. And what happens is it retrogrades back into Aquarius. So the retrograde starts in early Pisces, and then it goes back into Aquarius before stationing direct on March 9th. So the fact that it retrogrades from your eighth house back into your seventh house of relationships may imply that there's something about the partner's finances or other people's money that then gets tied into the issue of relationships and partnership in general when Mercury returns back to Aquarius and then stations direct in that sign. So this kind of emphasizes or re-emphasizes the idea that this may have to do with partnership and may have to do especially with agreements between you and another person, and things perhaps becoming a little fuzzy or nebulous and perhaps leading to miscommunications that force you to have to renegotiate or at least revisit something that you agreed on with another person. All right, so this is taking us into March, and that's the setup for things at the very beginning of the month, is that Mercury retrograde, which retrogrades back into your seventh house of relationships. One of the things that's notable about that is it seems to be setting up some major transits. The Mercury retrograde seems to be setting up some major transits in the sphere of relationships that really get going later in the month. And these are two transits primarily. One of them is Saturn moving into Aquarius and starting basically the very beginning of a long-term 2 or 3 year transit of Saturn through your seventh house of relationships. And then about a week later, we have Mars, which moves a little bit quicker, but also ingressing or moving into your seventh house of relationships, where it will stay for like a month or so, a little over a month and a half. So as soon as Saturn and Mars move into Aquarius, they pretty quickly form a conjunction with each other in the first degree of Aquarius in your seventh house in late March and early April. So this is kind of a problematic transit. So I'm not going to sugarcoat that too much because it kind of is what it is, but it may bring up some tumultuousness or some potential for tension in the sphere of relationships during that time. So at the very least, this is the start of a 2 or 3 year long transit of Saturn through your seventh house, which can be a testing period for relationships, where if you're already in a major relationship, you can go through sort of a challenging phase where you have to evaluate that relationship and decide how it's going, and in some instances perhaps make some adjustments in order to ensure the longevity of the relationship and in order to ensure that you both want to stay in the relationship. So you may have to ask yourself at various points during the course of this transit whether this is something that you still want to stay in, and if you do, whether you're willing to put in the hard work that may be necessary to keep the relationship together and to keep it stable and vibrant. And that may be a little bit more challenging than you thought previously, or you may have to do some things or commit to some things that you might otherwise not want to, but might be necessary for the sake of the relationship itself. Saturn often has to do with not just restrictions, but also obligations and duties and things that are kind of a chore, but are kind of necessary in some instances if you want something. So what's interesting about this transit is this is just kind of a preview of a longer term transit that's going to be playing out over the course of the next 3 years. But Saturn just sort of dips into Aquarius and into your seventh house, starting in this month, starting at the end of March, but it only stays there through like the end of June or the beginning of July, and then it retrogrades back out of Aquarius and back into Capricorn so that it can finish up the rest of that transit between July and December. Then eventually in December, Saturn will return back to Aquarius and it will stay in that sign for the next couple of years. So this creates a unique situation where what we have is sort of like a preview of a major long-term transit that's going to last for quite a while, and it's not going to get fully underway until December, but this preview phase could set up a sequence of events, or it could raise an obstacle so that it's going to become clear what some of the major themes and what some of the major challenges are over the course of the next 2 or 3 years as Saturn returns to that sign in December. But I really think that especially with Mars ingressing into that sign, with Mars moving into Aquarius almost simultaneously as Saturn does at the end of March, that whatever the primary difficulty is or obstacle or challenge that you have to meet and have to deal with head on, that it's going to become very clear during the course of April, especially early in April when those two planets conjoin in that sign. So for people with night charts, that might be a little bit more challenging of a long-term transit. For the people with day charts, it's that Mars period that's going to be more challenging, because Mars can bring up issues of strife, issues of separation, as well as just issues of irritability. So sometimes this can lead to a month or month and a half period of more strife or more fighting with a partner than you're used to. In other instances, it can lead to separations and the desire either on your part to separate from a partner or on a partner's part to separate from you if things are not going well. So certainly part of the advice is just to be careful not to do anything impulsively or anything that you don't want to have long-term ramifications if you're just saying something unthinkingly, or if you're just becoming irritable one day and creating problems with your partner. It could have longer-term ramifications than just being some low-level fight because of the significance of Saturn transiting into that sign at the same time. So those are sort of two things I would watch out for in terms of Saturn and Mars ingressing into that sign and what some of the dominant energies are going to be starting in late March and for most of April. So in terms of April, those two transits are still, you're right in the middle of that. In terms of outer planets, there is a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction that's taking place in Capricorn at that time in your sixth house. This could indicate a period of like rapid expansion in terms of your work, or in terms of something that you're working on in terms of your health, and potentially making rapid progress in terms of that. But you also have to be a little bit careful not to go too far, because Jupiter-Pluto combinations can tend towards extremes or tend towards extremism. So Jupiter already likes to expand rapidly, and Pluto just likes to amplify anything it's touching. So amplifying your efforts in the sixth house related to work or health could be the signature of that. And that could be something good or something bad, but you may want to be a little bit careful to urge moderation during the course of early April when that conjunction is going exact. Other than that, there's just normal lunations and interplanet ingresses during that time. Pluto stations retrograde in Capricorn later in the month, but that's really just intensifying the Jupiter transit for the most part. So I think we can move on to May. All right, so here's the astrology of May. One of the things that's happening is Saturn is stationing retrograde in Aquarius on May 11th, and this is going to indicate an intensification of what that Saturn transit through your seventh house of relationships is all about. So this is the first station of Saturn in Aquarius, and although Saturn kind of opened up the 3-year transit through your relationship sector when it moved into Aquarius at the end of March, this is one of the first times where Saturn is slowing down and stationing in that sign. And if any of you have planetary placements in your birth chart in the early degrees of the fixed signs, then that Saturn station is going to be squaring them through or hitting them through a hard aspect, and really probably telling you a lot about what the next few years of that transit are going to be about, for better or worse. So best case scenario, it's going to be about creating some long-term structures and creating some new structures in the area of relationships and how you relate to other people and how you differentiate yourself from those that you're close to in your life in general. The worst case scenario is that sense of differentiation and exclusion may lead you to sort of reject some relationships, or to determine that there's some relationships that aren't as important to you as you thought they used to be, and sort of making a decision to go it alone and to not focus on relationships as much can be one manifestation of a Saturn transit through the seventh house, and deciding to work more on yourself and sometimes less on your relationships due to that opposition between Saturn going through the seventh and opposing the first. So if that's one of the manifestations, or whatever the manifestation is, of Saturn through your seventh, this important turning point when Saturn stations retrograde is going to be one of the first real pivotal moments where you get a sense for what that overall 3-year transit is going to be like, especially if you have planets in early fixed signs. Interestingly, a few days after that, Mars actually completes its transit through Aquarius and leaves your seventh house of relationships on May 13th. And it moves into Pisces, which is your 8th house of shared resources. So this can put greater focus or emphasis or energy towards shared resource type issues, or resources that you share with a partner during this time for about a month or so, month and a half. It can also bring challenges or difficulties or strife involving other people's money or financial assets, which can be a little bit trickier, a little bit problematic when it comes to financial matters. Weirdly, like right around the same time, Venus is stationing retrograde in Gemini, which is your 11th house of friendship. And sometimes Venus retrograde can cause you to re-examine relationships in your life. In this context, it would especially be within the context of friendships. So getting a sense for whether certain friendships are working out for you, or whether there is an imbalance in the relationship that isn't really suiting you, either that's coming from you or coming from them. In other instances, it can be old friends coming back into your life and reestablishing friendships, or even developing a new friendship that comes into your life in a way that's notable and in a way that changes things in a significant way. One of the things to be a little bit careful about is that the Venus retrograde station is going to station pretty closely square Neptune in Pisces. So it has a bit of a Venus square Neptune vibe to that retrograde, which could be a little problematic if there's any connection between your friendships and financial matters, especially when it comes to issues of like debt or loans or like giving a loan to a friend or something like that. While I wouldn't necessarily tell you not to do that, if you have to like loan a friend money, in some instances, it might be best to, if you can't be careful about that because of issues surrounding nebulousness or miscommunication, you might want to at least not be attached to it so much if like you never got the loan repaid to a friend, but instead there was some sort of miscommunication or loss of money, then maybe it would be best to be sort of okay with that ahead of time rather than really expecting to have a very clear transaction. So it's a little difficult to describe, but basically just having a connection between the 11th house of friends and the 8th house of other people's money, and having a nebulous planet like Neptune involved just sounds a little bit tricky and sounds like it could be problematic in terms of establishing clear boundaries and clear agreements between those two parties or those two parts of your life. So maybe just expect things to be a little bit weird, and as long as you're okay with that, it doesn't necessarily have to be a major issue or a big deal. So that Venus retrograde begins on the 13th. Around the same time, Jupiter is stationing in Capricorn. It's stationing retrograde. So that's just a continuation of some of the developments with respect to your work or with respect to health issues that you're focused on over the course of the year. And hopefully, especially if you have a day chart, some positive developments that are happening in that area, and some rectifying of issues that had perhaps been a little bit challenging over the previous 2 years. Those are the major things that are happening most of May. Venus is retrograde in Gemini in your 11th house for the rest of the month. The halfway point in the Venus retrograde is the Sun-Venus conjunction on the 3rd of June. And at this point, about halfway into the year, we start getting into eclipse season again. So this is actually going to start off with a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius in your 5th house. And the 5th house traditionally pertains to things like children, if you have any children, or if there is any role that the general topic of children plays in your life, but also other topics like creativity, pleasures in general, or what you do for fun, as well as sexual matters is a main 5th house topic. So what's happening here is, since this is a lunar eclipse, it's kind of shining a spotlight or drawing attention towards the 5th house in a way that's unique or stands out in some way. So if for those of you that have children, this may draw greater attention towards children in your life for some reason, for better or worse. For some people that don't have children, one of the things that's notable is this is the first of a sequence of eclipses that are going to start bouncing back and forth between your 5th house of children and your 11th house of friendship over the course of the next year and a half, because the nodes have actually moved or are moving at this point into Sagittarius and Gemini. So you could see the topic of children or other 5th house topics starting to become much more prominent in your life over the course of the next year. Especially, so it sort of begins with this eclipse, but especially in December, we'll more fully move into that eclipse cycle once we completely finish out the Cancer Capricorn eclipses. But for this one, at least, starting to expect more focus on 5th house matters would be a pretty standard thing. All right, so that eclipse starts the month. Greater focus on children, possibly having fun, or just enjoyment in what you do for fun in general as a general theme and topic. Later in the month, or mid-month in June, Mercury stations retrograde in Cancer, Cancer being your 12th house, and then it is retrograde for the next 3 weeks. That's important, but it's also connected with a lunar solar eclipse, which takes place on the 21st of June, which is also in Cancer. And then finally, Venus stations direct on the 25th of the month, completing the entire Venus retrograde period. So the new moon solar eclipse that's happening in Cancer combined with the Mercury retrograde, both of which are in your 12th house, seems to imply some sort of focus on the topic of endings. So the 12th house is the last of the 12 houses. And oftentimes when we have things that are taking place in the 12th house, it can have to do with bringing something to completion or letting go of something. And this is one of the reasons why the 12th house was traditionally associated with things like loss, because the 12th house is representing the sort of end of the cycle where you're giving something up in preparation for moving into a new phase or moving into a new sort of sequence of your life. Now, with the solar eclipse there, again, it's been bouncing back and forth in that 6th house and 12th house axis for about a year and a half at this point. And this is one of the last major eclipses that's going to take place, at least in this sign as well as Capricorn. So this may be bringing up some themes that we were talking about earlier in the year that have to do with questions of not just bringing attention to and what your relationship is with people that you don't get along with in your life, but also ways in which sometimes you might be your own worst enemy or might undermine yourself in different ways. And what's important about this solar eclipse is that it's going to set up or open up a 6-month chapter in your life where you might have an opportunity to instigate some new actions or instigate some new attitudes in that area that could have a longer term impact over the course of the next 6 months. So if there's some sort of opportunity to address a relationship in your life where you're not getting along with somebody, or where you're really, let's say, like butting heads with somebody, or really coming even to blows with somebody, it might be important to establish the boundaries of that relationship very early on around the time of this eclipse, because whatever boundaries you do or don't establish are going to persist for several months after this point. So if you don't establish good boundaries with that person, or in some instances even stand up for yourself in some way, you may be opening yourself up to larger problems down the line. So that happens or pertains to both external issues with people you don't get along with in your life, as well as instances where if you have any bad habits, if there's some sort of new bad habit that develops at this time, you might want to be careful to try to curb it early on and address it early on. Otherwise, it could grow and develop into something more significant over the course of the next 6 months. So those are the two primary topics I would watch for and pay attention to in that area. And to some extent, the issues, or both of those topics, but especially the one with enemies or people that you don't get along with, could get exacerbated by the Mercury retrograde, because sometimes one of the reasons that we run into issues with other people or quote unquote enemies are created can be simply due to misunderstandings or miscommunications. So be careful during this Mercury retrograde, which starts and lasts for 3 weeks and starts on the 18th of June, to be clear in your communications, because sometimes you might inadvertently make somebody upset with you or turn somebody against you simply due to a misunderstanding. And that's one of the pieces of advice that I'd just be a little bit wary about in terms of that transit. All right, so that's not the last major transit that's happening in June. In fact, one of the other major transits that happens that opens up a few month time period is on the 27th of June, Mars ingresses into Aries. And normally this would just be like a 1 month transit. But what happens is that Mars moves into Aries in late June, and then it starts slowing down, and then eventually stations retrograde later in that sign, or towards the very end of that sign, in September. Then it's retrograde for a while, eventually stations direct, and doesn't get fully out of Aries until early next year. So this is beginning a transit that will basically last for the entirety of the second half of this year, when Mars moves into Aries on the 27th of June. So Aries is your 9th house, and the 9th house traditionally has to do with, it's kind of a packed house that deals with a few different categories, but one of the things that has to do with is education, especially educational things that are preparatory or will lead you towards whatever your career or your overall life direction is. And sometimes a Mars transit can lead to greater energy or greater energy expenditure in that area. Other times, the ninth house has to do with your religion or your belief system, whatever that is, or the things that you believe about how the world works. And then finally, the ninth house can also have to do with travel, especially foreign travel and exposure to foreign cultures and foreign ideas. So what's a little bit problematic about this Mars transit, especially if you have a day chart, is it could bring some strife or some potential for conflict in this area of your life. So if you're to take, for example, like a major trip, there could be some frustrations or some tensions involving that trip. Alternatively, if you're starting a course of study, there could be some tensions or some sort of drama surrounding your educational pursuits at this time. So maybe you have to like drop a course if you're in college or something like that due to some sort of unexplained or inexplicable tension that comes up over the course of that few month period. Whatever it is, it may be something that under normal circumstances would just come and go and be a minor thing, but for some reason gets extended and gets drawn out just a little bit longer than it should otherwise because Mars is moving so slow during this time. And if it's aspecting any personal planets in your birth chart, it's going to be doing so for a much longer, much more extended period of time than normal, which could be kind of aggravating or could be kind of taxing. The last thing that might be worth mentioning just in terms of the ninth house and its connection with religion and belief systems is that sometimes a Mars transit through the ninth or a retrograde in the ninth can indicate becoming upset or having some sort of separation or some sort of strife when it comes to your beliefs during this time, or even something like a crisis of faith. So that's a little bit more common for something like a Saturn transit, which takes 2 or 3 years to go through the ninth house. And I know some of the Taurus rising people have been dealing with over the past few years as Capricorn, as Saturn has been going through Capricorn, their ninth house. But something like this could be a short-term, a relatively short-term conflict with somebody that's based on either ideological or even like political or theological grounds, and getting into sort of conflict over your beliefs and what your different viewpoints are concerning the world at large or the world in general. So it's something to be aware of as you're dealing with this. It is creating a little bit of tension because what happens is that Saturn retrogrades back into Capricorn around this time into your sixth house of work and health. And Mars actually, when it stations retrograde in September, will be squaring that. So it could be creating some tension between your ninth house of belief and education and travel and your sixth house of work and health matters. So it might be important to be careful about potential tensions in that area. But I might be jumping ahead a little bit since that's really more of a September thing when Mars actually stations. All right, so those are the transits for June. Especially kicking off that Mars ingress into Aries, which is queuing us up for the retrograde period. Here's the transits for July, where we can see right at the start, Saturn retrogrades out of your seventh house of relationships, and it goes back into your sixth house of work and health. So if you're basically beginning the final stretch of that transit, which will last from July through mid to late December, and Saturn returning back to your sixth house is basically going to be making sure that you got the point of whatever that transit was about, and sometimes bringing those topics back to the forefront in your life again one last time. So this is kind of reemphasized by the eclipse, the lunar eclipse that's taking place in Capricorn around the 5th of the month, the 5th of July, which again is just putting extra focus or an extra spotlight on that area of health matters or matters pertaining to work. And not long after that, Mercury eventually stations direct on the 14th or on the 12th of July and finishes up its transit through your 12th house, or at least finishes up the retrograde transit. But really, most of this month is definitely dominated by Saturn returning back to the sixth house, and then there being an eclipse in the same sign. All right, so this is taking us forward finally into July. All right, so July transits. July's not a major month in terms of outer, or sorry, not July, but August is not a major month in terms of outer planet transits. The main thing that's happening that's notable is just the Uranus station, because Uranus gets to about 10 degrees of Taurus, and then it stations retrograde. So this is the furthest that Uranus has gotten into Taurus, like I was talking about earlier in the year, so that if you have any planets around 10 degrees of fixed signs, this is going to be a period where some of the, not just the rebelliousness, but some of the significations of disruption and unexpected shakeups are going to become particularly intense. This is primarily going to relate to your career and overall life direction because Uranus is transiting through your 10th house. Although anytime we have a planet transiting through the 10th house, it often will start making hard aspects with, for example, the degree of the ascendant, especially if your ascendant is around the 10th degree of Taurus. It will start aspecting the descendant or the degree of the descendant at some point, which represents relationships. And it'll also start opposing your 4th house. So while this Uranus station might be primarily important or primarily related to career in terms of what it's doing as it's transiting through your chart, it may also be indicating some major changes in terms of your sense of self, which could indicate things like your appearance or your bodily and physical vitality, as well as your character or just how you present yourself and how you come off and what sort of character traits you cultivate as a person with Uranus squaring your ascendant. It's also going to cause some major changes with respect to relationships, some of which might be somewhat unexpected or somewhat disruptive, which is kind of echoing some of the stuff we were talking about earlier this year with Saturn starting to move through that sign. And then finally, some of the career changes with Uranus in the 10th may be causing disruptions in terms of your private life and your home and your living situation, or potentially your parents, because the Uranus transit will be opposing the 4th house and any planets that may or may not be in your 4th house, or if you have the degree of the IC there at some point. So I wanted to mention that because that's one of 2 Uranus stations this year that are probably just going to be important turning points where, as we get further and further into that transit, some of the major changes that it represents in your life are going to become clearer and clearer. And for those of you with planets around 10 degrees of fixed signs, I think that's going to become particularly notable around this time in mid-August. So those are the major transits that are happening in August. And at this point, we move to September, where the primary thing that's happening and the most important thing that is happening is Mars stationing retrograde in late Aries on the 9th of September. So again, this just is it's one of 2 stations of Mars, but it's the one that's probably the most important one because it's setting up some of the primary tensions or potentially primary conflict in your 9th house of education and travel and belief. And at the same time, it's also going to be squaring Saturn from late Aries to late Capricorn and indicating probably some of the peak of tensions between those 2 areas of your chart. And the 9th house of like belief and travel and education, and the 6th house of health matters, as well as your workplace or whatever it is that you do for work, and a potential for some conflict in those areas, especially if you have planets in the late degrees of the cardinal signs. So around this time, Jupiter is stationing direct in Capricorn around the 12th of September, which hopefully will help balance things out or have some alleviation, some positive counterbalancing influence in the 6th house, to not fully outweigh Mars, but at least to indicate that there's some sort of positive rectification of difficult events, even if there are still tensions in that area of your life. And then finally, at the end of the month, we have Saturn making its final direct station in Capricorn before it moves out of that sign completely during this 30-year Saturn cycle. So whatever the final lesson is of Saturn transiting through Capricorn, especially if you have something important in Capricorn natally, like your natal Saturn placement, this would be the final turning point or the final most pivotal turning point of your Saturn return when Saturn makes its final station there and then eventually starts moving forward again and departs from Capricorn completely in December. All right, so those are the transits for September. That takes us forward to October. All right, so in October, we've got lunations. The main thing is there's a Mercury retrograde this month that starts in Scorpio and moves back to Libra. So we can see that here, the stationary point. Let me throw out the actual chart because this one has some interesting degrees that are going to be notable for some of you and are worth memorizing or mentioning. So here's the chart. And we see Mercury slowing down in Scorpio, and then it stops at 11 degrees of Scorpio. And Scorpio is your fourth house of your home and your living situation, and sometimes the parents. And Mercury then stations retrograde there for the next 3 weeks. And one of the things that's important to note here is notice how it's opposing Uranus when it stations retrograde. So it's setting up some sort of tension between the unexpected developments and the disruptions that are happening in the career sphere. But then Mercury goes retrograde in your fourth house of your home and living situation, which could cause either a revisiting of something relating to your living situation or a miscommunication involving something related to your living situation or potentially your parents or your private life. But it's creating this weird tension between the public life as represented by Uranus going through the 10th house and the 4th house as representing the private life. So although it starts off in Scorpio, Mercury eventually retrogrades back into Libra by the end of the month and then stations direct there in your 3rd house. So the 3rd house represents siblings, extended family, but also represents things like your neighborhood, the way that you communicate, and the way that you travel, especially locally. So having a Mercury retrograde there can be indicative of miscommunications, indicative of having to revisit things from a few weeks earlier. So things that first came up earlier in October that you thought were finished. It's also connecting the 4th house of the parents and the 3rd house of siblings. So it could be a miscommunication that somehow connects or bridges the gap between those two areas of your life and involves those two separate parts of your family for some reason. So the main piece of advice is just to be extra careful in terms of communication, or if you are signing a contract, for example, involving a 4th house party, so involving either your parents or involving your living situation, like if you were moving into a new place, or if somehow your siblings or other extended relatives were connected with your living situation, to attempt to avoid miscommunications during that time, because it could lead to general snafus and additional hassles that might otherwise be somewhat unnecessary. So the Mercury retrograde in October is really the main thing that stands out as being a sort of significant or notable transit that's going to be ongoing for a few weeks, for about 3 weeks at that point. This eventually takes us through into November. Mercury stations direct on the 3rd of November, and more notably, Mars stations direct on the 13th of November, finally in Aries. So I want to pull that up in the charts really quickly to show you the specific degrees. So Mars, we can see slowing down and stationing at about 15 degrees of Aries around the 14th of November. So this is the tail end of the retrograde period, and it's when some of the conflict or some of the difficulties that started back in September, or at least culminated back in September, are eventually start to be brought to some sort of resolution by this time. So these could involve like educational issues. It could involve a trip or travel or some sort of interaction with a foreign culture or a foreign country, which are common 9th house activities. Or it could simply have to do with some sort of conflict that's based in like ideological or political or religious grounds for you in terms of your background and your life in general. But it's really got this most active period between September, when the retrograde station first happens, and then mid-November when it finally stations direct. Elsewhere in November, at the very end of the month, we have the next set of eclipses, and we start the final eclipse season of the year, starting with a lunar eclipse, which is taking place in Gemini on the 30th of the month. So Gemini is your 11th house, so it's bringing greater focus and attention towards the sphere of friendships, and the role of friendship in your life in general is a broader theme, but also sometimes group efforts, or how you relate to groups of people, which can sometimes involve things like organizations. It can involve volunteering with groups and doing things based around a shared ideology or a shared belief system that unites you with sort of larger masses of people. That's one of the traditional associations that the 11th house has always had, is hopes and wishes, because the 11th house and planets in the 11th are sort of rising up to the 10th and hoping or aspiring to achieve something at the top of the chart. So this is setting up a series of eclipses that are going to keep bouncing back and forth between your 11th and your 5th houses. And during that time, the topic of friendship over the next year will probably become more important to you, either because there's a specific friend whose life becomes more intertwined with your own, or because for some reason you just end up being more involved in your friends' lives than you normally are. And it's going to keep happening in these 6-month increments. So starting with this eclipse, and then 6 months forward, we'll see another set of eclipses in the same sign. But just know that whatever starts at this point in your life, around late November, early December, related to friends, may not be what may seem like a small event at first, or a small development in your life, could have much larger long-term implications and ramifications than you realize at the time. So this finally brings us to December. And there's two major things we need to mention about December, because this is actually one of the biggest months of 2020, and it happens right at the end of the year. The first thing I need to mention is the second eclipse, which is a solar eclipse that's going to take place on December 14th in the sign of Sagittarius. So this is activating that other house in the pair that I was just talking about, which is the house that's opposite to the 11th house, which is the 5th house of children and creativity and pleasures and sex and other topics like that. But for some reason, this house is being activated again, and it's setting some sort of foundation or creating the seeds of something that are going to grow and develop over the next 6 months. So for some people, this can be something related to the topic of children in their life. You could maybe have children, or you could enter into a new phase of your child's life, or a new phase in the relationship with your children at this time that's somehow notable or distinct and more important than at other points in your life, because eclipses usually represent major bookmarks where a whole new chapter begins, or in some instances where a chapter ends, because eclipses are, my keyword for eclipses usually is that they represent great beginnings and great endings. So that's not the most important transit, though, that's happening this month, but instead the most important transits happen later, starting on the 17th, just a few days after that eclipse, when Saturn completes its 3-year transit through Capricorn and through your 6th house of work and health, and Saturn moves into Aquarius, which is your 7th house of relationships, where it's going to stay for the next couple of years. Just 2 days later, Jupiter joins it by moving into Aquarius, also into your 7th house. And then on the 21st, those two planets meet up and form a very rare 20-year conjunction in the very first degree of Aquarius in your 7th house of relationships. So I've talked about this transit a little bit earlier, because we had a preview of what this should be like between March and June, when Saturn first dipped into Aquarius and then retrograded back out of it. And during that time, that should have brought up some potential issues or potential difficulties that could have arisen in the sphere of relationships and shown you some areas that perhaps you need to work on where things might not be flowing as smoothly in the sphere of relationships as you thought up to this point, or at least could be forcing you to deal with some issues that maybe you'd been putting to the side and not fully addressing in previous years. So the downside or the difficult point of this transit is that over the next 2 years, you're going to be forced to deal with those issues head on, and you may not have a choice but to sort of work on them to some extent, especially if you're in a relationship and you'd like to maintain it. The good news is that this transit starts with Jupiter also moving into that sign and spending the first full year of Saturn in Aquarius moving through Aquarius with Saturn, so that Jupiter is going to be balancing things out. And while will be some soberness and some sense of reflection with Saturn moving through your seventh house, Jupiter is also going to balance it with some sense of optimism and some sense of stability, so that while there may be pulling back in some relationships, there may be a sort of growth and development and expansion in others. So maybe these are different relationships that are happening. Maybe this is happening in the same relationship where some things aren't going as well, but other things are going well in order to balance things out. But either way, I feel like it's a somewhat optimistic or somewhat positive start to that transit of Saturn through your seventh house, to have Jupiter there balancing things out at the same time, at least for the first year. Eventually, after this year, Jupiter will leave that sign and move into Pisces, and Saturn will still be moving through Aquarius, only about 2/3 of the way through that transit, and then it'll be like the last planet moving through that sign. But that's a really notable thing for you and seems to represent a major development at the very end of the year with respect to the topic of relationships, having such a rare 20-year conjunction of those two planets, the two largest planets in our solar system, besides the sun itself, taking place in the seventh house of relationships. And it seems to promise that by the end of 2020, relationships are not just the focus, but there's some sort of critical turning point or pivotal turning point that occurs in December of that year and sets up a whole series of events that will be playing out during the course of 2021. So, for some people that'll be more challenging, for others it'll be more positive, but in either way, in either instance, it seems to indicate that relationships will soon be a major focus of your life, even more than they have been in previous years. So those are the major transits and I believe that brings us to the end of 2020. Let me take a look. Yeah, there's no other major things that I meant to mention in terms of December, because it basically just ends with that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and then that's it. All right, so let me take a look at the live stream. How are things going? Does anybody have any questions as we're getting to the end of this in the live stream? We've got 84 people joining the live stream. Thanks everyone for joining me tonight. I appreciate it. So while I'm waiting for questions, there's a few things I meant to mention. So the artwork that I've been using for this video and for this podcast is coming from the calendar that I released, the posters that I released, which is the planetary alignments poster, the planetary movements poster, and the significations of the houses poster. So with these, you can sort of put them up on a wall and then be able to see when some of the different transits that I mentioned during the course of this episode start and end just at a glance by looking at it. So you can find out more information about those posters at the astrologypodcast.com/2020 posters. Leisa, Schaim, and I also just released the 2020 Auspicious Elections Full Year Ahead Electional Report, where we went through and we picked out one lucky date for each of the next 12 months for starting different types of ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So you can find out more information about that at chrisbrennanastrologer.com/2020 elections. And finally, I have to say thanks to all the patrons who supported the production of this episode of the podcast, because they're the reason we were able to get some of the equipment that I'm using to do this live stream. Thanks in particular to patrons Christine Stone, Nate Craddock, and Tanner Robinson, as well as the AstroGold Astrology app available at astrogold.io, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs at honeycomb.co. And there's two major astrology conferences happening in 2020. One of them is hosted by the International Society for Astrological Research, which is having a conference in September of 2020. You can find out more information about that at esar2020.org. And the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening in Seattle from May 21st through the 25th, 2020, which you can find out more information about at norwac.net. So if you want to become a patron and get access to bonus content like early access to new episodes or other things like that, find out more information at patreon.com/the Astrology Podcast. All right. I think that is it for this live stream. So good luck to all the Leo rising people during the course of 2020. So some people are asking about specific chart placements, but I can't necessarily get into that. One guy's waiting for their Honeycomb Almanac. Awesome. I think you'll really enjoy it. A lot of the podcast listeners have been getting those and posting them on Twitter and Facebook, which has been cool to see. I really enjoy it because it's nice being able to follow your exact transits. Here we've done kind of an overview of your transits, whereas Honeycomb is useful for finding and tracking some of the exact ones, which is a lot of fun and is very useful during the course of the year. I don't do chart readings, but on my consulting site, I link to other astrologers that do right now that I recommend to people just because I'm too busy doing the podcast to do individual consultations at this time. All right. Thanks everyone for joining me tonight. I think that's it for this video. So I think we had a delay today due to my internet being out. So I wasn't able to record as many horoscopes as I wanted to, but I'm hoping to be back in the morning to resume with the rising sign horoscopes for Virgo rising is the next one that I'll do starting tomorrow, first thing in the morning. So I'll see everybody tomorrow. In the meantime, good luck to all the Leo rising people. Have great transits this year and let me know how it goes in the comments section below. If you've already had some of these transits that have matched certain things in your life, then let me know and share some of those stories in the comments section below, because it's always good to share stories like that and learn how some of these archetypes manifest in more specific ways in a person's life. All right, good luck and enjoy the astrology of 2020, and I will see you guys again tomorrow.